Welcome everybody. Welcome, my name's David Wood and it's my pleasure and privilege to chair London Futurists. Today's topic is the post-COVID social contract trilemma, and our speaker is Bronwyn Williams, who is joining us all the way from Johannesburg in South Africa. Bronwyn is a partner at Flux Trends, where her research and consulting focuses on how macro socio-economic trends and emerging technologies will impact businesses, industries, and nations in the near and long-term future. And her particular areas of expertise include fintech trends, alternative economic models, and sustainable future design. All topics of great interest to London Futurists, I must say. Bronwyn's clients include top 40 companies listed on the JSE, that is the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and she is also the co-editor of the forthcoming book, The Future Starts Now, to be published by Bloomsbury UK in a couple of months. Her educational credentials include tertiary qualifications in marketing management at the University of Johannesburg, economics at the University of London, foresight at the University of Manchester, and future studies at the University of Stellenbosch. She is currently completing, in the midst of everything else, a Master in Applied Economics from the University of Bath in the UK. As Bronwyn speaks, you'll have the opportunity to think of questions you'd like her to answer in the discussion that will take place afterwards. If you're watching this live as part of the Zoom webinar, I ask you to write these questions into the Q&A window, which you can find via a button below the screen. Bronwyn, over to you.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. So as David said, I'm going to be talking you through just some of the observations that I have about what's happening with the social contract at the moment and some of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with, particularly as the new ideas that we are proposing to deal with the challenges that we're already facing have to actually come into fruition in the real world. And some of those ideas that have been tabled at the moment, I'm looking at them and I'm seeing that there are some gaps that perhaps we need to fully think about before we start rolling out and pushing these policies without interrogating how they're going to impact on each other as well as on us. So to start with, just to give you a bit of context as to where this particular presentation I'm going to take you through today comes from. It comes from a piece of work that I'm busy working on with a colleague called Doughnut, who works at Signal Risk, which is a think tank that looks at geopolitical risk from an African lens. And we've been looking at the future of geopolitics and how it is not as simple as it used to be. Geopolitics used to be essentially playing a game of chess. We played in the terrestrial world. We did things like have wars and battles and generals and borders, and everything was played on the terrestrial level. However, what we're starting to see now is that geopolitics has become obviously much more complicated. There are different layers of control, and where it gets particularly complicated is that each of those layers of control can actually have different alliances, which can be quite destabilizing, and they obviously interact with each other as well as with the different players on each of those four boards that we're playing. So we're kind of seeing this in a sort of a 4D chess environment, which is where the metaphor comes from. And the four layers that we've kind of identified and how we are trying to sort of hang the research that we're looking at on is the layer of muscle, which would be the terrestrial or real world, the layer of money, which is the layer of trade and commerce, the layer of medium, which is the control of infrastructure and things like undersea cables, for example, and then the layer of message, which is, in other words, a sort of meme warfare or maskurovska that we have been looking at and how that's starting to impact on geopolitics too. So what I'm taking you through today is what we've been looking at in the money layer. In particular, it's one segment of that particular piece of work, and how our trade and commerce and our capitalist systems are going to have to change, not just in the light of COVID, but actually also in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which we're still actually dealing with as a global society right now. So to bring things up to context a little bit, I think we all know what's been happening with the great unrest, as I'm terming it. This was the sort of cracks underneath our social contract that have been around for quite a while now. So what I've collected over here is a few images of some of the mass protests that were bubbling up under the surface even before COVID happened across the world. So over there you can see the massive pro-democracy protests that took place in Hong Kong. They're protests that were taking place due to the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement in America. There are mass movements across Asia, across Europe, across Africa, People are clearly unhappy with the status quo, and we can see this very, very visually. In fact, last year I was starting to collect images of all these mass protests, and it was both profound and quite scary to see all of these almost color revolutions taking place all across the world of very, very unhappy people. And what we sort of saw with COVID is that a lot of that unrest has sort of been put on pause for a bit, but we haven't actually dealt with any of those social issues, many of which are actually being driven due to rising inequality and dissatisfaction with the way that our world is ordered, particularly from an economic and a political perspective. What we see now coming out of COVID is, of course, an acceleration of that inequality and that resentment that has been bubbling under the surface for quite a long time now. I think the K-shaped recovery is, of course, a great way to illustrate exactly that. And then what we've seen is that the rich have got richer and the poor have got poorer. That's not just rich individuals that have got richer and poor individuals that have got poorer, but rich nations have got richer and poor nations have got poorer too. COVID has really accelerated a lot of those cracks in our social contract and exacerbated a lot of those divisions. And these are fundamental divisions that threaten to disrupt democracy in the nation state as we know it. Because a social contract that is unfairly weighted to one side of the population is simply not sustainable. At its core, any social contract really is a trade in that one group of the population pays protection money, and in exchange what we get is then services or security in the form of both physical security and physical security. And someone has to pay for that in order for the society to function. We need to have things like property rights. We need to have things like law and order. We need to have physical safety as well as physical safety for our social contracts to work. And because clearly those contracts are not working to the point that we're having to do things like helicopter money drops, and we're having to be imposing more and more strict regulations on people's physical movement in order to control a lot of that unrest, well, of course, we're getting to the point where we've all been talking about the Great Reset, as has been popularized by the World Economic Forum and many of those other international bodies. And the Great Reset is really asking us to think about the world that we have and that social contract that we have built. A social contract which up until quite recently was premised on the idea of democracy, capitalism, and globalization being an end, almost like that end of history narrative that we've heard. But sometimes history doesn't end conveniently the way we might want it to, and we have to rethink about these trends that we thought were indelible, that we're going to continue on forever, but perhaps there is going to be some sort of pushback. When I do trend research, we always tend to think of trends in terms of having an equal and opposite counter trend, which we do see whatever we're looking at. There's always a pushback, there's always an undercurrent of the seeds of its own destruction in any revolution that we have, whether that's a capital revolution or a social revolution. And just to come back at the sort of pendulum swing that we've seen on the world over the last sort of 20, 30 years, really almost a generation right now, there's sort of three pivotal years that are worth speaking about that speak to that story and the pendulum swing of those massive mega trends of democracy, neoliberal capitalism, and globalization. So 1989 was obviously a pivotal moment for those three forces. So much happened in 1989. There was a lot happening in my country, in South Africa, the end of apartheid, the seeds were sown right there. The Berlin Wall came down. There were many, many pushbacks against what had been going on in the preceding decades when it came to, say, the communist project. And it appeared that the era of capitalism was fully enforced and that those trends towards capitalism, democracy, and globalization were seemingly invincible. That's where the whole concept of the end of history came from. What we saw was that trend really carried on right up until the 2008-2009 financial crisis, when we saw that those movements weren't necessarily working for everyone. Democracy at that point has actually started to go on the decline. If we start looking at the world democracy indices, we can see that there are less democracies today than there were 5 years ago, which should give us pause for thought, those of us that were thinking that history was tending in a particular direction. If we talk about neoliberal capitalism, it clearly didn't work, or we wouldn't have had the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Since then, what we have seen is a lot more government intervention, not just on the physical side or the goods side of the market, but also on the monetary side of the markets across the board, actually across countries that have had more capitalist ideology and ones that have had more socialist or collectivist economic policy. We've seen an increase in the size of government, an increase in government intervention in the economy, so that we can see that sort of trend has already been pulling back up until today. Same thing with globalization. So globalization was something that was seen to be inevitable and was going to keep on continuing till we could have a one world type economy. But over the last decade or so, we have definitely seen cracks in that plan too, because globalization hasn't necessarily worked out equally for everyone. Globalization has done wonderful things in terms of reducing inequality between countries, but it has not been so successful at reducing inequality within borders. In fact, we've actually seen the opposite, particularly since the whole monetary expansion started after the 2008-2009-ish crises. And then, of course, 2020 was the next pivotal sort of moment in this project, this three-pronged project. And we all know what happened last year in terms of COVID and the responses to it, all of which have been a continuation of the downtrend of those three forces: democracy, neoliberal capitalism, and globalization. So any new great reset, any new rethinking of what the social contract is going to do, we have to start making a call as to whether that downtrend continues or whether this becomes another inflection point and we start moving into another era of that, which I'm not sure really makes sense at this point in time, because we still haven't dealt with the issues of the last upswing of those three grand plans that we had. Instead, what we're going to have to do is to come up with some new ideas. And that's what we like to say, particularly when it comes to economic ideas. Economic ideas that start out quite small and in academic circles do tend to take hold of the world and reshape the world in its own images. Whether you're talking about any of those three prongs, they can have their seeds back in conversations economists were having over the last few centuries. So it's a good idea to sort of look at what's going on there, what those new ideas on the table are, and what they mean for society and for the new social contract we're going to have to build right now, because clearly what we've had simply is not working for enough people to be sustainable going forward. So the first of those big economic ideas that is on the table is the whole concept of doughnut economics that was created by the economist Kate Raworth, and it makes a lot of sense. It essentially takes the UN sustainability goals and turns it into a delicious looking donut that it should help us redistribute the spoils of capitalism that have not been equitably distributed over the last few decades more equitably, and at the same time it also encourages us to work within our natural resource bounds. So that's where the donut metaphor comes from. For those of you that aren't familiar with the concept, it talks about two rings. One inner ring below which no human being should fall. So it talks about a minimum standard of living we should be provisioning for all members of society to build a strong social contract there. And the outer layer or the outer ring of the donut really speaks to not overshooting our natural resource endowments, to making sure that we don't overscale and that we don't overpollute our planet and that we don't exacerbate any more things like climate change going forward. So it's quite a radical rethink, although it sounds quite simple. It's really asking us to change all of our economic models from being growth focused to being sustainability focused. So the sort of flip side of that is, of course, things like degrowth, for example, would be required in some places that are currently overshooting the outer bounds of their donut, which is quite a big ask for societies, actually asking people to shrink their economic forecasts to actually make do with less going forward, rather than premising our economies on continual growth and increased prosperity. This is really talking about much more managed economies, not just on the supply side, but also on the demand side. So that's just a bit of thinking that I think is worth speaking about, because pretty much all the ideas that I'm going to talk you through today do have something to do with this donut model. It really does underpin a lot of the Great Reset conversations that are being had across pretty much any national or the international bodies that are talking about Great Reset type projects. So I'm going to leave that here for a second and move on to the three big ideas that you came here to sort of talk to me about today. And that is the three big options that are being put on the table from economic circles as to how we can redesign our social contracts going forward. And what these three ideas I'm going to talk you through today have in common is that they all essentially come back to this quote from Whose Line Is It Anyway?, which speaks about where everything is made up and the points don't matter. They all talk about an increased separation between the real economy and the financial economy. So they're all essentially financial solutions to real problems. So the first one we can speak about, which was, I think, spoken about quite a lot at the last meeting that the London Futurists had, is talking about fully automated luxury communism, which is more popularly known these days as universal basic income. So universal basic income is an idea that has gone from being quite heterodox to being quite normalized very, very quickly. And it has been particularly normalized thanks to COVID and the fact that many governments have actually had to implement programs like this to give people basic income to help them to survive during the COVID crisis. But it's looking like more and more nations are wanting to make these programs full-time and long range. And there's many arguments for it. The first one being, of course, that technological progress is said to, in the future, diminish labor's share of the economy, and that there are going to be less jobs available for human beings. And as such, we have to find some way to replace what was earned income with some form of unearned income. Universal basic income obviously has great attractive qualities to it from all corners of the economic ideologies that you might be looking at. Libertarians even would find it more attractive than a messy social welfare system, in that it will reduce a lot of deadweight loss and reduce a lot of the disincentive to work that many other welfare entitlement projects have. Likewise, people that have more left-leaning ideology when it comes to economics will obviously find programs like this very, very attractive, because they do allow labor and the most vulnerable people in society to have at least that basic safety net to make sure they don't fall through the hole of the proverbial donut. And of course, the dream here is that ultimately none of us will have to work. We'll all get to live in luxury like the Jetsons, having machines do everything that we need. And we're then free to pursue the dreams and the things that make us happy and that fulfill us as human beings. So obviously it's a wonderful picture to be painted, but there are definitely questions as to how we can fund things like this and what the impact that sort of distribution of money will have on the real world and access to real resources for beneficiaries. And also, from my perspective, also the underlying subtext that in a world of fully automated luxury communism and universal basic income, it implies that real resources, the real economy, the machines themselves that would be doing more of that work, would be owned by quite a small subset of society. Whether that is a big government or whether that is a big tech company, that is something that we need to think about. So if we all own nothing and yet we are happy getting what we need to survive, who does own that? And what does that do for real inequality and real inequality of power as well as money on the ground? Just as a sort of proviso there, we can also look at the sort of people who are the biggest proponents of these sorts of policies. They do tend to be people in positions already of power, particularly from a monetary perspective. A lot of your biggest technocrats and wealthiest people in the world do support these sorts of programs. I'm not going to make a judgment on that right now, but I do think that these sorts of incentives are worth looking at as we try to decide whether these are policies that we want to pursue, whether this is an end that we want to work towards, firstly, and secondly, if it is an end that we want, the world of fully automated luxury communism, is then universal basic income the best means to get us to that point? And I'll leave a lot of these questions with you so we can talk about them after I've gone through the other topics I want to cover today. The second big idea that everyone is suddenly talking about, also that was completely unheard of in January last year, but a lot has happened over the course of the last year, and modern monetary theory, which went from being very fringe, has become very, very mainstream very, very quickly, particularly thanks to Stephanie Kelton's work with her book, The Deficit Myth, which has popularized this fringe idea and given it a lot of daylight in the mainstream media. Once again, like universal basic income, On paper, on the advertising side of this program, there's not much not to like. Essentially, the core of modern monetary theory really says that we don't have to worry about government debt and deficits because governments have a sovereign monopoly over their own currency supplies, and as such, governments should be able to spend as much money as they require into existence without implementing austerity measures such as increasing taxation or reducing welfare entitlements, both of which obviously are hugely unpolitically palatable right now in a world where we have constrained economic conditions. So on paper, particularly for politicians, it sounds like the perfect solution. We're able to spend the money we require into existence. We don't have to worry about deficits. We should stop worrying about that as the core driver of how we run our monetary policies. And instead, we just need to make sure that we're not spending too much money that we end up causing inflation. So proponents of modern monetary theory do acknowledge that an increase of money supply that goes too far above covering the productivity gap will result in inflation. So that's the only real limit to spending. We shouldn't be constrained by what taxes the market can bear. So once again, it definitely sounds great on paper, but I'll get into a little bit later why these ideas are clashing with things like universal basic income and with the third idea that's got a lot of sunlight over the last year. And that, of course, would be magic internet money, or Bitcoin in particular, or cryptocurrencies in general. So cryptocurrencies are the idea that we can have private international borderless money that is not controlled by sovereign governments and that allow citizens to both protect their wealth from threats of things like inflation and to make really huge outsized gains from investing in these currencies on the stock market, essentially, or the distributed stock markets that are really backed up by things like your cryptocurrencies. So of course, cryptocurrencies were started in the wake of the 2009 financial crisis too, coming back to my chart that I showed you earlier. The white paper was dropped in 2009, and it is very much a part of the rethinking of the social contract that came about after the financial crisis, where a lot of people was seeing that private money was a political tool to get back agency in a world where governments were getting bigger from both a financial perspective and from a social control perspective. And we have to bear this in mind, that when we talk about money, we're always talking about power and politics. And the power and politics narrative and story behind cryptocurrencies is really very disruptive, particularly when we start to contrast it with the ideas of things like universal basic income, doughnut economics, and modern monetary theory. And that's really the point of this short talk I'm trying to do for you today, and that social contracts are premised, like I said, in an exchange of physical and physical freedoms for physical and physical security. That is, in essence, the social contract of a democratic nation state. We agree to submit to rule of law, we agree to pay a certain percentage of our income or wealth over in taxes, and in exchange we get a certain basket of entitlements and social welfare nets that are able to keep us safe, and we also get a basic level of law and order to keep us physically safe and to enforce our things like property and personal rights. What I'm really seeing right now is that when we start to combine these ideas of increased money supply along with increased entitlements with that wild card of what cryptocurrencies really are, which is really quite subversive, we start to see that there's some cracks developing in our social contract. And I've tried to summarize them as simply as possible just to get you all to see where my head's at in terms of the long order effects of the interactions of these big ideas lying around that have all been oxygenated right now. And I can talk you through them very, very quickly. The first one is probably the easiest one to resolve, and I've got some examples we can go through a bit later today. And then there's fundamentally the sort of people that have been proponents of universal basic income are quite ideologically opposed actually to proponents of modern monetary theory itself. Because what you can see it as being is sort of universal basic income is essentially free money, it's strings free money, everyone gets it, and you don't have to work for it. You don't have to prove that you have jumped through hoops, you don't have to be surveilled in any way. Everyone gets access to a basic living income. It is free money with no strings attached. Modern monetary theory also promises free money, but it promises free money with some strings attached, because the flip side of modern monetary theory itself, as is proposed by Stephanie Kelton, its biggest proponent, is that the money that is being injected into the marketplace through monetary expansion programs that is being spent into existence should be spent in ways that increase the physical multiplier, and particularly in the form of a jobs guarantee, which, when you think about it, is quite ideologically different to the idea of a universal basic income. A universal basic income is premised on the idea there's not going to be enough jobs in the future. There's simply not going to be enough things for humans to do. And that's why we need a strings-free attached or no strings attached access to free money. At the same time, modern monetary theory says that we actually can't put too much money into the marketplace unless we also increasing our productivity. And the way they propose to do that is to offer anyone that wants to work a government guaranteed job. But you see, there's a bit of a contrast there. So people that are talking about a post-work world won't necessarily buy into that idea. So this is really an ideological challenge, that there's some work to be done on both those sides to find common ground if both of those ideas are to live together. The idea of either we have to have jobs, a jobs guarantee, in essence really almost forced labor, or we're not going to have work at all. They're quite different ends that are being proposed by those two ideas. But still, I think that's the easiest conflict to resolve. The next ones get a little bit more tricky, particularly from that social contract perspective. And the next one there is Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. I'm using the acronym BTC, so it fits in quite nicely with the three-letter acronyms I have on the screen, but you can really apply this to any cryptocurrency, which is, as I said, borderless, free, private money, being contrasted by universal basic income. So what these two ideas set up, when you start to contrast them together and see how they will interact in the future if they are both applied at scale by nation states or by individuals, is we see there's a conflict there in that it allows people a perverse incentive to be libertarian with their own money, but socialist with everyone else's. In other words, they provide a way for us to cheat the social contract. And they do this quite simply because when you do start dishing out things like helicopter money or universal basic incomes, people that are living hand to mouth will probably spend a lot of that money, but people that are a bit wealthier, for example, will now have some money to save. And there is quite a big temptation for those people to save their money in things like cryptocurrencies rather than spending that back into the marketplace. It also effectively, what cryptocurrencies do is they allow us to set up private tax havens that cannot be taxed, which means that they're accessible not just to the very wealthy, as tax havens have been in the past, but they are accessible really to anyone that has disposable income that they want to protect or they want to withhold from the social contract agreement. And that's where the problem comes in. It allows people to opt out of contributing to the social contract while still getting to benefit from the social contract. So in this sort of world, people that are holding cryptocurrencies as a sort of tax haven have an incentive to say, I'm not going to pay any taxes because I get to earn my income in cryptocurrency. I can spend it within the walled garden that cryptocurrencies do provide for me as more and more people are buying into that system. But I still get to live in the real world. I still get to benefit from things like a social security safety net, to benefit from things like Medicare or national health insurance. They still get to benefit from the rule of law. They still get to benefit from things like property rights, but they now have a way to opt out of paying to fund it. And I'll go in a bit deeper in just a second on how difficult it is to plug those particular leaks. But the essential contrast right there stands, that it allows people to benefit from society without contributing to it. The third conflict is quite similar, and that's the conflict between monetary expansion in order to fund the growth of society or to fund increases in entitlements, contrasted once again with the concept of private money. Now, as I mentioned, when it comes to things like modern monetary theory or sovereign money, which we'll get into a bit later, it is premised on the idea that the government has sufficient control over monetary policy in that country. And that is once again where cryptocurrencies pose quite a big challenge, because cryptocurrencies are private money. They are borderless money. They are not tied to a particular social contract. This means that if cryptocurrencies are operating at scale within your nation state loses control over all the levers of monetary policy that are required to implement things like modern monetary theory without running the risk of things like inflation. Essentially, it comes down to old Gresham's law with the thing of bad money chasing good money out of circulation. And we can see this is already happening in the United States in that as, for example, the dollar gets more, as the monetary policy is quite expansionary, people are investing that money into cryptocurrencies. They're not necessarily spending it back into the marketplace. Now, modern monetary theory, as I mentioned, is premised on the idea that as the money supply is increased, it is used to increase productivity, to increase that physical multiplier. So it's premised on the idea that the new money is actually going to be spent back into the economy. When people are instead converting their new wealth into private money and not putting it back into the country, it increases the risk of things like inflation. But it's even worse than that. It also creates a deep perverse incentive for people that have decided to change their bad inflationary money into good deflationary money in the form of cryptocurrencies to actually encourage the breakdown of the social contract. Because what an investment in cryptocurrency is, it's not just a bet against the dollar, it's a bet against the nation state, which is quite a bold claim that I'm making, but I think if we can see it that way, we can start to have more productive conversations as to what's really on the table here. And that's what I'm trying to say here, is that as soon as you own a specific or a large quantity of your wealth in private money that is not able to be taxed, that does not contribute to Caesar's universe, if you want to use that analogy, you have a perverse incentive to accelerate the devaluation of sovereign currency, because as long as the sovereign currency is losing value, in other words, as long as the social contract is weakening, your personal investment in the private currency is increasing. So that's quite worrying for me, the perverse incentives that go into play there. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, after you've heard all of this, how serious it is. Is cryptocurrencies really that destabilizing? Does it really pose a real threat to the social contract? And I really think it does. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but going forward, governments are going to have to find a way to plug the leaks across their physical and physical moats. In order for the social contract to work, we have to make sure everyone is contributing as well as benefiting. And that means that if we want to have tighter control and more ability to manipulate things like our monetary policy and our fiscal policy, we have to get control of that whole monetary system. And the first thing that governments are going to try and do, and we've already seen that, is to try plug the leaks through increasing taxation. Because what happens with those leaks when you've got a leak into borderless private money is that, of course, your deficits get bigger and you've got to plug those gaps. You've got to make sure everyone is contributing. So we're already seeing a trend towards more creative taxes, as I like to call them. Everything from work from home taxes is being proposed to reduce inequality and to share the burden of what's happened with COVID, right through to things like unrealized capital gains tax, which is really quite extraordinary. And of course, wealth tax, that conversation isn't going anywhere. And taxes are being used as a lever by governments, not just to physically plug the physical hole, but also to try and reduce inequality, because that is the other thing. When it comes to private currencies, they do tend to once again make the rich richer and the poor poorer, which, as I opened today, was really one of the biggest issues that we're really facing when it comes to the cracks in the social contract that I'm seeing right now. And now, just to try and illustrate just how serious that problem is, I think that if you're not familiar with what's going on with the world of private currencies and cryptocurrencies, the first thing to do is to see how difficult it is to control them. And they have to be controlled if we want to have control of our monetary policy. I'm not saying we do, but I am saying that if you don't, you're going to get a breakdown in that social contract. And there's quite a big difference between the sort of levers that strong states versus weak states have in order to block those on-ramps and off-ramps to make sure that you're not getting too many leaks in your bucket, that you do have control of that full big picture of your economy. So we can start with strong states. So strong states would be states like the United States, perhaps like parts of the EU, and like China, who have control over all the on-ramps and off-ramps. And here we have to be able to control both physical and, once again, physical on-ramps and off-ramps to make sure that people are paying their taxes and paying their dues and contributing according to the terms of the social contract that you have. But even in strong states, states like China have tried to ban things like cryptocurrencies and have been found wanting. It's very, very difficult to ban something that doesn't have a physical address where you can go and arrest the board members. These are entirely distributed centers. They are borderless, they are international, and they are hosted increasingly on even internet networks that are in satellites rather than on a physical location. You can't shut down these networks very easily. However, if you are a very strong state, you can have more control over the physical layer of your countries, like places like China do have, and that means that people are unable to use any of their private money in order to buy real-world goods and services. So there are ways to crack down on that if you have a strong state and if your state has the will to use force to enforce its right to be a sovereign state. So unfortunately, though, for weak states, as is a good example here is Nigeria, how its central bank's been putting out statements recently over the last few weeks saying how they don't believe it's possible even to control cryptocurrencies and what they're doing in their marketplaces. In those weak states, more and more we're going to see more and more of those sort of smaller, weaker states actually giving up here and allowing these currencies to become essentially parallel economies. From an African perspective, this has already been the case. We've had massive grey markets for a very, very long time in an informalized financial system. There are lots of people that don't contribute directly to the social contract. However, that also makes development very, very difficult. If you're not able to collect taxes from large proportions of both your labor force and your entrepreneurial classes, you're simply unable to use that money for growth and development. And that's actually one of the big reasons why Africa's development has lagged behind some of the other emerging marketplaces. I think it's worth speaking about because this is the sort of contrast we see. It comes back to the increasing divisions between rich nations and poor nations, strong states and weaker states. But looking forward, I really think, coming back to my original metaphor that I opened with, that China's probably the only state that has control, the required control over all those 4 layers of its own marketplace, that it will be able to successfully defend its sovereign currency from the risk that private currencies pose to full economic control. So I'm kind of using the metaphor of like a Wi-Fi curtain. You have to have control over all those layers if you want to stop this risk. I haven't really seen any argument coming from economists or from proponents of the crypto class to really suggest otherwise. Government's either going to have to understand that parallel economies are here, and that means that the function of the state, of the nation state, of democracy is going to have to change to fit this new world, this new, much more leaky, porous, globalized without permission world that we are heading forward today. But just to sort of put this point in a slightly different way to close off with, I do come from South Africa, and of course, if we're talking about inequality, we're probably ahead of the rest of the world, unfortunately there. I'm not seeing much evidence that the trend away from inequality is going to be imminent without some very, very strong action from both the public and the private sector going forward. This is, of course, the shot, an infamous shot from Cape Town that shows the huge divide that we have there. But what's happening next is we can see that inequality is almost concentrating into what I'm terming to be a new neo-feudal type of system. And this is both can be seen in the physical world and in the physical world once again. So we're seeing a kind of rise of private cities coming up once again. We're seeing lots of trends and indicators of that, even down to Nevada, the United States, now allowing company towns to actually put proposals together to collect their own taxes. So I mean, this is not something that's just happening in places like South Africa, where we've had walled cities and private enclaves and compounds where the rich have gathered to both live and work and play, removing themselves more and more from society. And this metaphor of these enclosed cities that are essentially basically compounds, or like the contemporary version of castles, are happening in the physical world too, thanks once again to the walled gardens that private currencies are enabling, particularly for the richest and most powerful members of society to opt out of contributing to that social contract. If you want another example here, I like to throw in a few case studies to sort of drive these points home, is that coming out of the crypto world, we have this concept of personal shares, which allows people to sell shares in their future income to strangers using cryptocurrency-based platforms or decentralized token exchanges. So the lady on the screen there with the beautiful, colorful hair is a lady by the name of Coin Artist, and she was one of the first people to actually sell shares in her future earning potential. Now, for those of us that understand history, this doesn't sound all that different to sort of selling your birthright to a master in exchange for a secure place to live, but you're also then giving up a whole lot of your agency because you're essentially attached to this master that has funded yourself. So of course, these things are being proposed as a way for individuals to access equity funding rather than just debt funding, which obviously has its own problems. But I do think that these sort of signposts towards a more feudalized, both digital world and real world, are worth considering as we think about what we are doing with the new policies that we implement in order to counteract the cracks that we are seeing in our social contracts. And of course, this sort of end point here, because of course it's unlikely to roll out exactly like this, but what we can kind of see if we sort of run this through to its illogical final conclusion is that perhaps the world that we are tending towards, whether advertently or inadvertently, is a world of increased separation, where the masses and masses of people are more and more controlled by much bigger governments, while the very, very rich are able to opt out of society into both digital feudal kingdoms and also into physical micronations, which is also trending at the moment, particularly if you look up at what billionaires like Peter Thiel are interested in doing in things like seasteading as a way for the very, very wealthy to literally opt out of society in both a physical and a physical perspective. And that's really the question that I want to leave you with today. Are there other new ideas lying around that could fix these cracks before we reach breaking point, that can help us to avoid that very, very segregated world of pockets of wealth, setting up little miniature kingdoms in amongst a lot more constrained, wider world? And there's sort of two ideas that I can put on the table before I open up for questions. The first would be that what was spoken about actually here at the London Futurists Association with the speakers that were talking about sovereign money as a way to reconcile the ideological differences between modern monetary theory and universal basic income, to look at a more inclusive way to make sure everyone is fed, but without having to be forced to be more productive. So I'm sure David can talk to you more about that, or he can point you in the direction of that talk, which has been recorded. And the other idea that I think is worth exploring is a way to re-bring that private emerging economy back into touch with the real world, with the social contract, through what I'm terming open basic income as an alternative to universal basic income. So universal basic income is universally applied to everyone. So it's not opt-out, it's not opt-in, it's centrally managed. An open basic income, however, is open to anyone to join, but it's not compulsory to anyone to contribute to. And there are several interesting projects you can look at there. One would be Circles UBI, which I think should change their name to Circles OBI, which actually looks at a free market funded version of a universal basic income that does not require central control in order to manage. It's incentive run, and it's almost a way to go back to a kind of a barter economy where everyone gets access to a certain amount of that private currency if they're able to spend. But it's also a way to make sure that wealthy people who have the option to opt out of the contract are sort of encouraged to contribute back to it. There are other models here that also look at open-based voluntary systems, voluntary for both beneficiaries and for funders, that are self-reinforcing, coming out of South Africa once again. One great example there is an opportunity for businesses to contribute to a basic income fund in exchange for getting what we call in our country broad-based economic empowerment points, which is required basically as an affirmative action type project for any company listed in South Africa has to contribute or has to submit one of those scorecards, which gives them access to various levels of funding and also access to public sector projects. This would be a way to sort of self-reinforce that in order to incentivize both the giving and the receiving of these programs without having to resort to things like increased money supply, which could chase private money inadvertently out of that social contract altogether. So those are more speculative ideas, but I think that they are at least worth talking about, because we should never be hung up on the means. We should always be keeping our eyes a little bit further towards the end as to what the world is that we are tending towards, and if we like it. And if not, whatever we're going to do about it is definitely worth debating. So I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to hand back to David now, because that's the end of the talk that I prepared for you today.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. There's so much. I've taken page after page of notes. I'm going to encourage members of the audience to think about which topics they would like to prioritize. There's already 5 questions that people have somehow found enough mental bandwidth to type into the Q&A window. What I'd like the audience to do is to pose short, ideally, questions yourself, as well as vote for which questions you think should come to the top of the list, because we probably won't get around them all, though we will try to do so. My first question to you, Bronwyn, is about inequality. You did say we're getting more inequality. There are neoliberals or others who will say, hang on, even the poorer people are getting a lot richer than they used to be. Why should they be complaining? Isn't it that we have a growth of perceived inequality? There are all these theories and ideologies around which tell people they are being exploited, but in reality their lives in many ways have never been better. How would you react to that characterization?
Well, inequality is fundamentally about difference. It's about relative position in society. It's not about absolute progress. So the absolute progress conversation is a different conversation. And there's definitely room to be said that life is progressing for most people. And there's all the conversations about rising tides lift all boats. In reality, rising tides lift most boats, but some people are absolutely still left behind. But from my perspective, and from the point of this particular talk, is talking about the stability that comes from inequality. And even if everybody is getting better off in real terms, if inequality is increasing, our social contracts become more fragile, because human beings are social creatures. Status and relative position translate directly into our happiness and to our life outcomes. I mean, like, we can even look at studies of what's happened in some of those European nations where tax returns are made public, so everyone knows exactly who owns what. And we look at those, and we can actually look at what happens to people's happiness in those countries. And those Nordic nations tend to be less unequal in the rest of the world. But when people see that data, people that are wealthier get happier, and people that are less well off actually get more unhappy, because knowing that you are in a world that other people are succeeding to a degree far greater than your own does not make for happiness, does not make for a strong social contract, particularly in a world where there are opportunities for people to opt out of that social contract. And that becomes hugely destabilizing. It creates huge amounts of resentment. And we've got to look at those global protests that are taking place, most of which have an undercurrent of inequality being the reason for why people are physically taking to the streets. Whether you're looking at the Black Lives Matter protests or about the Me Too protests, it's about inequality of treatment, inequality of outcome, inequality of experience. So morally, we don't have to take a moral perspective as to whether we should permit equality or not, but practically, if we want to build strong societies, we have to make people feel that even if their lives are not perfectly equal, that there is a realistic opportunity that they are able to reduce that gap within their own lifetimes. And that's a lot of the challenge that we're seeing as the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The left behind people don't see a legitimate way for them to move from one bucket to the other without breaking the contract that we have. So I would say we need to tread very, very carefully on this. Inequality is directly correlated with social instability in the physical layer.
The question with the most votes currently is by Neil K. He asks about MMT and the risks of economic hyperinflation. Isn't what you're saying, MMT, confirmation that in reality MMT is likely to create economic stagflation and hyperinflation?
Personally, wearing my sort of more positive hats rather than the normative perspective looking at it, yes, that's what I'm getting at. In theory, modern monetary theory can avoid hyperinflation by maintaining full control over their monetary policy. If you have a benevolent, all-powerful monetary policy committee that is able to control the flow of money and make sure that money supply is not increased to a level that stops reducing the productivity gap, because that is how the theory goes. If we put too much money into the system, that it then overshoots the productivity gap, that we have too much goods chasing too little money, then we're going to get some inflation. Now, the problem that I'm trying to put across today is that private money creates a leak in that bucket, a leak in that control, and that is almost directly likely to lead to increased inflation that central bankers will be unable to control. That is what I'm hypothesizing. I don't know if I'm right, but I don't see that my opinion is inconsistent even with the proponents of one monetary theory, who do say it requires monetary sovereignty. It requires that country to have a monopoly over money, and the existence of private currencies mean they no longer have a monopoly. We now have competition for currency, even in the world's biggest countries. So that is what I'm getting at today.
Thanks. So let's talk about the private money, the cryptocurrencies and so on. Do you take seriously the possibility there's going to be a backlash against them because of the enormous energy usage? And it's been remarked that the energy involved to mining bitcoins is comparable to that of a medium-sized or possibly a small country. But as the price of Bitcoin rises, there are economic incentives which will mean that more and more energy is spent. And will this cause people to say, hang on, this is unsustainable? And maybe governments will get more involved than they are to say, if we're serious about not frying the planet with the greenhouse gases, then we've got to stop this particular Bitcoin experiment.
Absolutely. There's already a pushback against that. People are appalled at the amounts of energy these systems are using. Now, to give a more balanced view, I think it is fair to point out that much of the energy used in the network currently is renewable energy. And in fact, there's quite good data to show that the very existence of energy-intensive cryptocurrencies has actually increased the investment in renewable energies in quite some surprising territories. So in fact, a lot of that energy usage is actually coming from sort of surplus from renewables that are like have too much capacity during, say, like amenable periods to generating that renewable energy, but then of course during peak times, then that energy goes back to the general grid. So that's the argument that is coming out of the cryptocurrency community. I think it would be disingenuous not to mention it, that they are quite committed to green energy and to actually perhaps making the world a better place in that regard. But they're still going to get pushback. It still does generate a huge amount of energy. However, in terms of actually shutting it down, it's not that simple, because it's a global network. If your government bans all Bitcoin mining, the next government next door that might be perhaps a less sort of ethically advanced state that might actually want the money might actually start encouraging that. In fact, a lot of the countries where a lot of mining is taking place are in weaker states like I spoke of, that might actually benefit from that cash, that might see the cash incentive or the monetary incentives being more important than the environmental disincentive. And because it is a global network, it doesn't actually matter where that energy is coming from, as long as one territory somewhere is still permissive of people to produce that energy, the network will continue whether your government likes it or not. It is very, very difficult to shut this down. No one has been able to do it. And there's very good arguments to say that perhaps if we wanted to shut it down, we should have done it 10 years ago. It's a bit too late now. The network is too big, it's too distributed, there's too many people hugely invested in it. And the way it's been set up, it is very, very anti-fragile. So that answers your question in several different ways. But if you want to interrogate my answers at all, I'm welcome to go a bit deeper into that.
From Hamed Sumero, do you think society is actually ready for the kind of pace of change that you are talking about? As currently, people are struggling to make sense of it all. And will people be able to adapt with the forces that you've been describing?
Absolutely, I do not think so. All these ideas I've spoken to you about today are complicated ideas that people who are proponents of them understand very, very well, but society at large does not understand how these ideas are going to impact on them. That's why I like to talk about these things. That's why I like to talk about them to as broad audiences as possible. And I try to make them as simple as possible, because they're very complicated concepts to get your head around. And unfortunately, proponents of all these ideas focus only on the sunshine and not on the cost. People will tell you the promise, but they won't tell you the payment that is required. Every choice comes with a trade-off. Maybe you support some of these ideas, maybe you don't. I'm trying not to sell any of them. I'm trying to present them as they are presented by their proponents, and then create a few more questions so that people can go away and make up your own mind as to if these are ends that we want to have at the end of the day. When it comes to cryptocurrencies in particular, I think they have been sold as get-rich-quick schemes. They're very, very attractive. And look at those wonderful charts going up. Number go up. Who doesn't love that? But I don't think the people, the vast majority of people that are investing in them understand just how subversive they are to the social contract. Now, if you are of a libertarian bent, you might be totally delighted about this. The idea of the nation state collapsing and the social contract being replaced by a state of nature where the strongest and richest get to make their own rules might actually be amazingly attractive to you. However, if you are someone that likes ideas of things like redistributive policies and social safety nets, you might not have been explained in that terms, that this is exactly what is actually being built by people that are proponents of private currencies, and vice versa, because everyone's got a different ideology, everyone wants a different mix of things. But I don't think that we have enough conversations cross paths from these different ideologies that are all selling a different vision and not understanding how that vision impacts on the next guy's vision. Because of course, people that are more interested in cryptocurrencies and in more laissez-faire markets might be very, very resistant to the ideas of things like fully automated luxury communism. They're appealing to very, very different people. What I do find quite ironic is that both fully automated luxury communism and the idea of the sovereign individual, which is the sort of ideology that goes behind cryptocurrencies, essentially end up with the same world that I was trying to describe to you today. A much more feudalized world where all real resources, or most real resources, and most real power, most real force, is concentrated in very, very few hands, and everyone else gets to submit essentially to those powers, whether on the one hand it's a bigger government, or on the other side it's a very, very wealthy technocrat. Because of course the whole sort of live on Mars and pay off your indentured labor is very much a similar end result as to what is being sold by some of the other sides. So there's common grounds to be had in all sorts of unexpected places, but I would definitely encourage you to understand these ideas. And if I haven't done a good idea of explaining them, I would encourage you to go and read up on them yourself, because they are important and they are going to change policy in the world around us in a real way, not just in a financial way.
What you're saying about cryptocurrency reminds me of the discussions about social media 10 years ago, which was, hey, social media is bound to do good, isn't it? It's bound to connect people. It's bound to help people to discover things and form communities. And it's only in the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, increasingly people are saying, there are potential very bad consequences to social media. And likewise, you're saying with the cryptocurrencies that for all the positives there might be, you might end up with a weakening of a nation or international states, which will then break up the social contract. And that is something I'm going to have to think about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's powerful technologies. Technology itself is amoral, but what we do with them and how we apply them do actually change the future that we end up living in. And I definitely want more people asking more questions rather than just sort of submitting to the views of the loudest voices in the room, because they're very persuasive. They're very, very persuasive.
In terms of possible alternatives to the global cryptocurrencies, PNJ has asked, what about local currencies? And people are creating local currencies. It's an idea that's been around for a long time, but it's one of the ideas that seem to be getting a bit more traction. Is that something you've looked at?
I have looked at local currencies and I absolutely love them. In fact, there's many more local currencies and they have a larger share of our marketplace than we might realize, because loyalty point schemes are effectively a local currency. I don't know how it is in your country, but in my country, all the big banks, all the big insurers, all the big retailers all offer some sort of points-based system that we're able to trade and essentially barter within their network for goods and services. Now, from my personal perspective, I think more choice is better than less choice, and I don't have an inherent problem with competitive currencies. I'm not sure I'm totally comfortable with the government having total monopoly over currency. And I like the idea that we are able to trade on a more local basis, whether it's through our corporate networks or through our physical neighborhood networks. I think these are generally good ideas for building resilient local communities and also for building deep ties within our societies. And that's the beauty of network effects, as much as we can talk about the negatives. When we have strong ties, even with small communities, we're much more resilient as the social beings that we are as human beings. So that's my personal perspective. They are probably going to increase, and cryptocurrencies are not just Bitcoin. There's many, many local versions of that too. So once again, I'd encourage you not to see anything in terms of being homogenous or as being sort of one winner takes all. More choice for me is generally better. That's also why I actually kind of like nation-state borders, because it allows us to have choice in the ideology and the sort of governments that we live under. But that's a personal perspective. It's not a normative observation.
The question that's now top is from an anonymous attendee who's asking about your discussion of strong states. You know, we need a strong state to oversee the social contract. We may need a very strong state to deal with the possible downsides of private cryptocurrencies. But isn't this a bit like the old argument for communism? It sounds absolutely wonderful in theory, but history has shown that human nature, being what it is, has a propensity to be self-serving. How does the strong state argument avoid repeating the dire lessons from the Politburo?
I would agree with that. I'm not advocating for strong states. I'm making the observation that unless you have a strong state that's able to maintain control over all those 4 layers that I illustrated, you're not going to be able to stop cryptocurrencies. You're going to have to find a way to live with them. So, or private money. So that's the choice. I'm trying to articulate the choice that nations have. And if you are going to be a strong state, you're going to have to be able to have the appetite to apply that strength in terms of physical force too, because you're going to have to stop people from spending their private money on goods and services within your territory, and you're going to have to stop people physically leaving with their private keys in their pockets if you want to make sure you have full control over your nation state. I think that we definitely have to be concerned about giving total control to very, very strong states. We know history has given us many, many things to think about there. I'm absolutely not advocating that as a suggestion as to what we should be doing. I'm putting it out there as any state, any democracy is going to have to make the choice whether they are going to allow these parallel markets to live in existence and then accept the threat to the social contract, or if you want to make the choice to have the appetite to apply stronger force that might actually be a little bit contradictory to democratic liberal values that we've become accustomed to. It's a very hard choice. There are absolutely no easy answers here. But I'm trying to illustrate the stakes at hand, because I don't think many people have illustrated the real world stakes that come on board from physical policies.
Julian Snape in chat picked you up when you said UBI is another name for fully automated luxury communism, or vice versa. Julian says, is this really an equivalence, given that communism, depends on your definition, I guess, communism is about public ownership of the means of production. But you have suggested that we could leave all the big tech companies in their own hands and they would continue to be their own companies. So what justifies you in putting these two concepts together?
That's a very good question, because they're not actually often sold together, although John Danvers' book, I think, does refer to them on very similar terms, which is where I picked it up from. And I like it because it's a great visual hook to think about fully automated luxury communism. What's nice about that descriptor, it reaches across the divide. It talks about how if we can have communal ownership and can have universal basic income, it could actually be much nicer than the versions of communism that have been tried in the past. So I use that to try and be diplomatic and to make sure that we're painting these things according to the way that proponents of these projects would like them to be portrayed in the marketplace. Now, when it comes to universal basic income, how I can justify using that particular example rather than just talking about universal basic income is that if you sort of follow universal basic income ideology through to its logical end, it does talk about a world where we won't be able to earn our living. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's why it is being justified right now, because we will be unable to work. We're going to have to rely on some sort of a handout, whether that's from a technocrat that owns the private city or the planet Mars that we have to work in or live in, or whatever territory we're in. We will have to be a dependent on that controller of resources. Now, taken to its logical conclusion, the post-work world, which is often spoken about in conjunction with universal basic income, does speak to a world where machines do all the work. And if machines do all the work, it implies that someone or somebody or some group controls that totality of machines. It doesn't actually allow much space for private ownership, taken to its logical conclusion. In the interim, there's obviously a lot of nuance. So we can have small bits of basic income that don't even cover all of our needs. They could just be a little bit of like things like the helicopter money we've seen. And they're different degrees of strength that people are pushing these different policies. But I do like to think as a futurist a little bit further down the line as to what we're heading. What is the end world that a concept like universal basic income paints? And the end world that it paints really is a world where humans don't work, but we get income, or we get our goods, our needs, our basic needs provisioned by some sort of external entity, if that makes sense. So I know that I was a bit cheeky pushing those two together quite so soon, but it's because I have been looking at this for quite some time as to where the thought leaders that are proposing these sorts of things are seeing the future world, how it fits in.
I'll just add one more name to this set, Callum Chase, who has written about the economic singularity. He has produced a new edition of his book with a new subtitle, and I think the subtitle this time is Fully Automated Luxury Capitalism, where he says that we can get to this post-world work with a universal basic income. He's not actually a great fan of that. In fact, he's actually a critic of UBI, let's be clear, if Calum's watching this in some state. But he says that we need to utilize some of the free market aspects of capitalism rather than a central control of planning in order to get to a state in which there is enough of an abundance created. So there's another mischievous combination. He has taken the same four-letter acronym FALC and changed the C from communism to capitalism. There's another question about fully automated luxury communism from an anonymous attendee who says, well, it sounds like a PR agency has been working on improving the brand image of the Chinese Communist Party in the West. Aren't you risking subverting Western democracy and promoting the issues of the Chinese Communist Party?
I'm not promoting any of this. I'm not selling any of these. So that would be my comment there. So.
So you're just setting out the scenarios, you're setting out the contradictions, the tensions, the possible overlaps, and leaving it to others to figure out what's desirable.
Although to be completely honest there, I mean, I am a critic of universal basic income from my perspective as a futurist, and personally, I do think it is a low bar utopia. I think it's like a fire sale future. I think there are better things that we can be doing. But that would be my 5 cents worth from a personal perspective, rather than just from trying to paint the picture of what could be.
Well, most people who advocate UBI will say it's only a start, it's only a part of so it might be 5 cents, but there's more to come. And what would be if not 5 cents, what would be the 500 Rand version instead?
That would be the fully automated luxury communism vision, where we have total abundance and we don't have to work for it. So that's the bolder future, which is why I try to include it, to be fair to people that are proposing these ideas. So I don't like to, at least when I'm presenting, I don't want to cloud people's judgment too much with my own personal opinions, which are probably not the same as anyone else's. And I don't think that anyone is required to agree with my personal opinions. I would hope that you might agree with some of my logic so we can have conversations about what we should do next. But my objective here is not today to sell my personal opinion on these various entities.
Well, my own business card alongside futurist had the word catalyst for a long time, rather than evangelist. An evangelist is somebody who says, I know the way, follow me, it's over here. And a catalyst says, what about this, what about this? And stimulates.
Yeah, please don't follow me, find your own way. I don't want to lead you.
That's great. OBI, you raised this very interesting possibility, which I hadn't heard of before. And I'm still not sure what's going to cause people to invest in an OBI. People invest in the national government in a sense because we're obliged to, otherwise we'll be taken off to prison if we don't pay our taxes. And we sort of think, well, it's a good idea, yes. But if we ever wanted to backslide, we realize it's difficult to backslide. But what's going to make people continue to invest in an OBI, an open basic income scheme?
Yeah, so the open basic income term is something that I coined myself to try and distinguish it, because I started to see quite a few of these projects coming on board. And essentially, the reason why people would invest in or agree to contribute to something like an open basic income is very similar to the reasons why people started to invest in things like Bitcoin itself in the first place. Because essentially, it's backed by nothing other than network effect, right? I mean, especially the people that got in early. You have to get more people to buy into the network in order to give that thing value. And on this sort of using the crypto type space logic, what people that have been building these open basic type income projects are finding ways to make sustainable call self-funding systems that are reliant not on kindness or altruism, but on self-interest. So there are many, many different models, and we don't have a huge amount of time now. Maybe I can just explain the one that I spoke about in South Africa and about how our thing works. So it uses existing inefficiencies in the system and finds a way to turn it into a self-perpetual, self-funding, self-sustaining system. So like many countries, we have affirmative action type policies. In South Africa, they're quite stringent. Like you have to have this BEE, I get mixed up with the acronym, scorecard that every business has to complete. And it has real financial costs if you don't have a good scorecard. Now, one of the ways that you can improve your scorecard so that you can take advantage of being part of the South African economy as a business is to have ownership, minority, or not actually minority, but have Black-owned ownership of your stock or of your business itself. Now, if you're a small business owner and you're not of the correct skin color, it's very, very difficult for you then to actually say you're a two-person business. In order to have an over 50% Black ownership of your board, you're going to have to change your whole business structure. So many businesses sort of left out of that system and find themselves falling through the cracks. So this was actually proposed by a former political leader in South Africa who was part of one of our member of parliament. And he thought there was a way, and he hasn't actually done this to make money from himself. He suggested that a way for smaller businesses to actually, and also bigger businesses too, to improve their ownership scorecard to meet those criteria that we're trying to have to build a more equitable economy would be to, instead of selling stock in their company, which is impractical for a tiny, small SME business, but rather to contribute a percentage of their revenue to a national open basic income fund, which would then pay out a basic income to every disadvantaged member of society. So it's effective ownership. It effectively works as the dividend, but without that owner having to sell shares in their business, which is impractical. So you see there's a huge incentive for businesses then to contribute to that. They then get their BE scorecard points. They are able to participate in the economy legally and ethically. And at the same time, it could be used to fund income for less advantaged people in society. For businesses, it would save them money compared to the other opportunities they have to improve their scorecards. So there's a big incentive there. Now that's very manual, but if you want a more sort of technological one, there was another project that's actually, it's changed a bit in shape, but they call themselves Project UBU, which was Project UBU. And what they did, the way they got their sort of universal basic income system to self-sustain itself, is they applied to the self-interest of retailers. So with their system that they set up, anyone could join it for free. And in exchange, you got X amount of UBU tokens, which is basically like a private currency or a local currency. And those UBU tokens were able to be spent at any of the retailers that signed up to the network. So why would retailers sign up to the network? Well, effectively, UBU then operates as a loyalty program that retailer does not have to manage themselves. Retailers already give away points, as we were speaking about earlier, that can be redeemed for goods and services within the network. And the idea would be that a retailer would only commit to selling X value of goods per day to UBU customers. But in exchange, and they obviously get access to things like data and opportunities to network to those people. So they developed a system, a way to get that whole sort of system working on a self-sustainable basis. Now, UBU itself, just to put a pin in that one, due to the funders of it, they've changed their business model quite a lot since then. But having read the white paper, you can see how these projects are being developed and tested to try and build self-sustaining, self-funding private currency networks that also won't actually affect monetary policy of the greater community, because they're effectively like local currencies now. They're not disruptive currencies like cryptocurrencies themselves. But the one project I would encourage you to look at if you are interested in that is Circles UBI. It is an international cryptocurrency that's based on sort of barter economy logic, but by signing up, you get to trade goods and services with other people in the network for a fixed amount of tokens that you get essentially for free. And the idea is to make more inclusive economies, to bring people that are outside the formal economy into a particular, or at least a sort of ring-fenced economy. But they're very interesting models to look at there. And if we're clever with incentives, there are ways to make these things self-sustaining and beneficial for all parties, even though it sounds crazy when you think about it at first.
Well, that says Circles UBI. I think
Circles is the live project. It's worth looking at, yeah.
I think people should look into this. It's not something that's come up on previous London Futurists that I remember. So let's put that onto the table. Time for a few more questions and then we may have to wrap up. Antonio Urquiza asks about an acronym you haven't talked about, SC, stakeholder capitalism. Would that be part of the solution, or is SC sort of not ambitious enough and just whitewashing or greenwashing, whatever the phrase is?
It's just a regulatory tweak, man. And that basically applies to the same sort of thing as the affirmative action scorecards I was speaking about. It's a regulatory play. So if governments regulate certain criteria that corporates have to play in an economy, they can change the incentive, change the rules. Maybe that's a way to fit into another sort of self-sustaining type open basic income program. You know, like if you can trade carbon credits, maybe you'll be able to trade sort of stakeholder equity points, and that sort of funding could be used for a self-sustaining system. I haven't included that in this particular presentation because it's part of the whole Doughnut Economics logic. That's actually where it would fit in that it's about making sure that the economy is a bit more managed and that anything, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, is operating within that donut logic, making sure that it is contributing to equity and also to ecology. So it was there, but tangentially, because I don't think that's really an economic policy so much as more like a regulatory environment. Of course, it's all connected, and the more sort of stringent those controls are, to tie into my incentive conversation today, the more we try and force corporates to behave according to more and more onerous sort of regulations and to more and more restrictions, the more temptation we give them to opt out of the system. And if you want to see all the corporates that are currently putting their cash surplus into Bitcoin, that might give you pause for thought before you start to implement these programs without reciprocal incentives that make it of value to the corporate too. So I would put that out there just as a sort of observation there as to the risk of pushing these policies in certain marketplaces where people aren't necessarily seeing the return there. Of course, there's also very good arguments as to why stakeholder capitalism is actually a profit incentive. If you look at the way ESG stocks have done compared to non-ESG stocks and indices, we might not have to impose those regulations if consumers demand that behavior from the companies that they support. So from my perspective, I would like to see more customers, more end users demanding better behavior, really demanding, not just telling market researchers they want more ethical businesses, but actually backing more ethical businesses. You won't have to regulate the stakeholder capitalism. The market could regulate itself if we as users cared enough. So that would be my 2-minute rant on that.
What's
subject.
The phrase? Doing business for good is good business, or it should be.
It should be. It should be. But we have to hold those companies to account. Relying on regulators is a bit lazy.
So you touched there on the donut economy again. Right at the beginning, you said the donut economy probably requires some degrowth. Scary thoughts.
In some places, it would require degrowth because that's the whole model. Wherever you are overshooting your ecological bounds, you have to reduce. That goes back to the old Donella Meadows sort of idea of limits to growth. It means you have to operate within those limits. And there are some nations that are overshooting those bounds in terms of energy consumption and in terms of usage of natural resources. So it does require that. It sounds very comfortable. But again, when you interrogate it, we're going to have, if you want to follow that model, either some people are going to have to make do with less, or we're going to have to find a way to have growth that does not impact on sustainability. And I have a few ideas around that, but that's a slightly different topic for a different day. And that I think that the virtual economies are underexplored as a way to get limitless growth, or at least less limited growth. But that is a slightly different conversation.
The virtual economies. So we
yeah,
might
Metaversonomics.
Metaversonomics. Yes. So instead of all going to some very expensive real estate or some tropical paradise and ruining it by our heavy footprint, we put on our headsets, and maybe more than our headsets, and we have a virtual paradise.
I'm not so keen on replacing real experiences because I'm a warm-bodied mammal. Like I think that we shouldn't forget about our physical environment and our real needs. But I'm more excited about things like what's happening with the NFT market and what's happening with digital goods and services and young creators across the world getting involved in trading digital goods and services and making real money from virtual trades. And I think that's really exciting. Like the whole virtual garment industry, it might sound crazy to us, but isn't that better than fast fashion? And it's a way for those creators and creatives to make real money and to really be not dependent members of future society, but independent members of future society. And I think that's beautiful. And I think that those opportunities, that's the more positive narrative that I've been looking at, which is different to what we've spoken about today. It doesn't change any of that. What I try to speak about today was the impact on the real world, the real social contract that we have to get our heads around.
Bob Reitemeyer wants you to say a little bit more about the donut metaphor. He asks, what's required to ensure all countries stay within that sustainable circle? It's probably that's a big question, but
I don't think you really can enforce that. We don't have a monopoly on global power. I mean, the United States used to be that guy, but we don't have any nation that's strong enough to force that worldview onto everyone else right now. We do rely on peer pressure quite a lot, and that's what the international bodies have tried to do. And you will find that the World Economic Forum, International Monetary Fund, all of those good guys are kind of pushing that same agenda right now. Basically, all those policies are Doughnut Economy supporting, if you want to put it that way. So there's quite a lot of, when you interrogate a lot of those international policies, they are filtering into that idea. I like the donut metaphor because it's easy to get your head around. If you have been looking at all these different policies that are being floated, that once you fit them into the donut, you kind of get a picture as to what's actually on the table when Klaus Schwab talks about, you know, the Great Reset. That's really what he's talking about.
You mentioned that there might be ways in which we could achieve more with less, which is almost the title of Andrew McAfee from MIT's recent book, when he shows, at least in some areas, our footprint on the earth is going down, despite us having in many ways a better quality of life. It's not in every area, and there are lots of concerns, as Andrew McAfee points out, but it may be that we can get inside that circles without having a degrowth in experience or a degrowth in quality of life.
That's absolutely my hope. Unfortunately, it's not been pushed by the key proponents of donut economics. In fact, Kate Roth herself has said that she does not believe that sustainable growth is possible. That's what she wrote in the foreword to her own book. So I think that it's important for us futurists to challenge those ideas, because that's what progress is. Progress is literally doing more with less. And I don't want us to lose sight of that, because it's going to be very difficult for me to tell my 6-year-old daughter that she's going to have to live in a degrowth world because we ate her dinner. I have the responsibility to find a way that she's going to be able to have my quality of life and then some, without impacting on the quality of the life of the next person and the next generation too. I think that's the responsibility of every generation, to try and do more with less. And I hope that we can be more optimistic about that. And I think that there are ways. There are lots of exciting things. We're quite creative, and we have a lot going for us as human beings. Even if you look at space travel, that opens up a whole lot of less limits. So for me, I think the realistic future is somewhere in between Donello Meadows' sort of very wise lecturing of us not to overshoot our bounds, and Ray Kurzweil's total limitless. I think that's also a little bit unrealistic. I think the real future is somewhere in between those worldviews, and we should be bearing in mind how we can grow the donuts, not just how we can live within the donuts. I'd like to see us growing the proverbial donuts.
We want to be positive, but you have said that there are threats to the nation state. Anonymous attendee, who's got the highest voted of the questions left, says, where do you think the threat to the nation state is most likely to come from? Is it from people who feel that political leaders have failed them and that they rise up against them in various ways? Or might it be from elite Bitcoin actions who put lots of resources outside the hands of even the strongest of nation states?
Well, for me, that is exactly it. It's both those things happening at the same time. When the elite are able to retreat to private cities and walled states and leave everyone else behind. I mean, that's like the sort of Ayn Rand vision, right? That's the sort of survival of the strongest and the richest, and behind the walls, you get a very different quality of life to everyone without the walls. But the social contract really unravels when governments are unable to supply the entitlements that they have promised people, and not just what they've promised people, what people have become accustomed to, and that is a concern. Particularly living in South Africa, we've got such a large percentage of our population that lives off the charity of the state, that lives off grants. In effect, we really have the world's largest universal basic income program. I mean, we're not calling it that, but if you talk at the number of people that are living off very small amounts of money being distributed from the state, if the state's unable to provide that, then that society really does break down, and you end up devolving into a state of nature where the rich are able to retreat and cause vicious and virtuous circles to abound. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, but on a very, very extreme level. And I think that once again, living in South Africa, we can see that metaphors already played out. I mean, all of the best futurists in our country, when they look at the scenarios, the most likely scenarios really are this sort of feudalized society, this compound society where the rich live behind high walls, have their own private shopping centers, their own private currencies, their own private security. They don't require the social contract to support them, but they also don't feel obligated to contribute to what happens beyond their walls. I mean, if you want a good example as to how chaotic that can get, Octavia Butler's books definitely do speak to those same sort of themes in a very much more dramatic level. I don't think it is going to be that dramatic, but I do think that our social contracts, the way they're set up, are quite fragile. They require contributions on both sides, they require buy-in, and they can't really support too many exceptions. But it's both of those things happening at the same time, that tug of war that makes it so fragile right now. We've got more people that are reliant on welfare, and at the same time we've got more options for more people to opt out of that. And it's not even just the uber elite now, we're talking about your upper middle classes too. Again, from South African point of view, in terms of our middle classes, our middle class has shrank by 55% over the last 4 years, if you want to see the social contract collapsing there in real time. But at the same time, and most of those people have actually dropped into poverty below the middle class. But at the same time, average household income has increased. And that just means that the rich have got that much richer, which is quite extraordinary. It's a tale of two societies. And that is a social contract collapsing, not with a bang, but with a slow decline. And that's what I'm concerned about. We have to rethink if that's what we want. Are we happy to have a world that reverts to a state of nature where it is the strongest that gets to dictate, the strongest and the richest, and the rest of us have to sort of deal with the scraps around us? I hope that sort of answers your question.
Well, it does. Brings us on a downer again. We'll finish off the discussion in a few minutes.
Let's talk about digital clothes again. That's
well, but the risk is that what comes next after capitalism is feudalism or techno-feudalism.
That's what I'm seeing. And whether we follow the universal basic income idea of the future or the crypto idea of the future, they both sort of end up in a more feudal world again. And I think that social futurists too, who look at social trends, also see a lot of parallels ahead with Middle Ages from an ideological, social perspective, not just from a financial perspective. We only spoke about money today, but there are a lot of reasons for us to think that you know, we're in a declining empire age right now. What comes next, though, is really up to us, and I would prefer us to avoid a new dark age.
You referred to the writings of Octavia Butler as a possible source of ideas. Where would you start? Which?
There's the Parable of the Sower, and then there's a follow-on from there. I mean, like she's got a lot of public attention over the last year because of how prescient those books were. They were written in the 90s. And the reason why they sort of came to the fore again was because the second book in that series actually talks about an American president who ran on the ticket of Make America Great Again. So she got a lot of well-deserved praise for spotting that one before it came. But the first one in that series illustrates the sort of nightmare scenario, the worst case scenario of the world that I've spoken about, of a social contract collapsing, and a social contract collapsing in a way that South Africans like myself understand all too well, because it talks about gated communities where the middle classes lock themselves away from a society that's falling apart behind the gates. And that's a sort of metaphor that I had in mind while I was compiling this. It is, of course, more dramatic than real life. Things are seldom as bad or good as we think they are, but it's an interesting read in terms of illustrating a social collapse. Of course, The Mandibles too by Lionel Shriver also speaks a lot of the same things that I've been talking about here, if you're interested in science fiction, because I think as futurists we kind of have to be.
We have to be, indeed. It lets us think things through differently. Is there a positive solution, Julian Snape asks, by nation states setting up their own cryptocurrencies on a national level, which they can control and therefore they look after the taxation I guess this is the
They can set them up.
CBDCs that people are
The
talking
central
about
bank
as well.
digital currencies, yes, absolutely they can. That makes one monetary theory and universal basic income programs and taxation much easier, but it does not stop the leak in the bucket from private cryptocurrencies. It doesn't, that doesn't change any of the things that I've spoken about today. It just makes the money printing temptation that much easier, and makes that much easier to control your side of the balance sheet, but it has no impact as really, no real scalable impact on preventing people from using private options instead, unless you are an incredibly strong state like a China that has control, that full Wi-Fi curtain, all those different layers, control, and the appetites to apply that control to stop people from using them in the real world. So it's the same issues that I spoke about.
Well, we've gone over time, I'm afraid. I'll come back to you in a minute, if you don't mind. I'll give you a chance, Bronwyn, to make any final points that you feel deserve being in the forefront of people's minds as they leave. Let me very quickly first just look at the future of London Futurists. Today, we've been looking at this social contract trilemma. In 7 days' time, we will be having another speaker, as it happens, from South Africa, Professor Mark Solms, although I believe he may be in Sussex for the time being, talking about a different topic, but I think of great interest to the future, which is the possibility that, as we've understood the brain a lot more in the last 10, 20 years, might this change our ability to create an artificial consciousness? If we're talking about robots taking our jobs, maybe some of these robots want to just be automated and intelligent. They might have consciousness too, perhaps. So I've been reading that book recently. I'm 3/4 of the way through it. It is a bit like the talk we just had, Bronwyn. It brings together lots of different ideas from different disciplines and backgrounds and shows surprising synergies, but also tensions. So that's in 7 days' time. In 11 days' time, this isn't a London Futurist event, but it's by the French Transhumanist Association. They are doing 2 days of events, one in French on Tuesday the 16th, and one in English on Wednesday the 17th of March. If you search online for Viridian Conference, you can find out more about how to get involved with that, looking at transhumanist ideas for building a sustainable environment with renewable energies. And I think some of the topics that have come up today will almost certainly come up in that as well. So registration for that is open, and there may still be a chance to squeeze in a few short additional talks. I think the speakers there get 10 to 15 minutes. Looking 14 days ahead, we have Tracy Follows, a UK-based futurist, talking about fragmentation of identity, whereas Mark Solms' talk is a little bit philosophical, none the worse for that. This is a very practical book about how technologies of all sorts isn't just disturbing our social contract, as we've heard today, but might be disturbing our own sense of identity. We've always had multiple identities. We've always presented different faces, in a sense, to the different groups of people that we interact with at different times. But technology is taking this to a much higher level, and with likes of social media representing us in new ways. So that's what Tracy will be discussing based on her still forthcoming book, The Future of You. And looking further into the future, one more London Futurist event is in the calendar, talking about technology's impact possibly on the extinction of humans and other species. That's Phil Torres, an X-Risks researcher, and his book will be coming out by then too, or if not then, shortly afterwards. It's just been accepted for publication. It's a human extinction, a history of thinking about the end of the world. So that's what's coming up next. Today we have had the wonderful set of provocations and inspirations from Bronwyn Williams. Bronwyn, is there anything you'd like to add before we finally pull the plug on this fascinating discussion?
No, thank you so much for tuning in today. And if you want to connect with me, I'm quite easy to find on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'd definitely be keen to continue this conversation, because I think these are ideas that should be debated more in an open forum and not just behind sort of closed doors and hallowed halls of academia and economics, etc.
I want to thank you very much, Bronwyn, for pulling together a very engaging set of slides, graphically attractive, but also very thoughtful in terms of the ideas. There's a lot to think about. As I said, I took lots of notes and I'll be following up there too, both the science fiction and in some of the real world experiments that you have been pointing to. So thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.